hold on to your hats. Today, the economic tremors between the U.S. and Canada, they just turned into an earthquake. We're talking a stark 35% tariff hike hitting Canadian imports right at our northern border.
Yeah, it's big news.
And this isn't just, random trade wrangling. It's framed as a direct response from the U.S. administration. They're explicitly linking this really aggressive economic move to, well, the critical national security threat posed by illicit drug flows, especially fentanyl.
Mm-hmm.
And the move really highlights a foundational principle, at least from their perspective.
Yeah.
When national security is on the line, you need decisive action, protecting communities, protecting borders.
That's certainly the framing.
But it's so much more complicated than just spreadsheets and trade deficits, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's a deeply complex, evolving story. You've got these international accusations meeting, well, domestic realities.
Right. And a public health crisis suddenly becoming a tool for economic leverage. It's intense.
It really is.
So today, we're going to try and unpack why the U.S. is escalating pressure on Canada like this. And we'll look at how this whole situation is shaping Canada's own economy, its political landscape too, especially with this major new legislation they're pushing through, the One Canadian Economy Act.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is how these huge global challenges like the fentanyl crisis, which is, let's face it, a deeply human tragedy, are being strategically used, wielded almost as leverage in international trade disputes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you connect that to the bigger geopolitical picture, it raises a pretty crucial question. How do nations respond when these external pressures basically demand significant internal change? And what are the real stakes? Not just for businesses, but for everyday people, for citizens on both sides of the border.
Exactly. So you might be wondering, what does this actually mean for you, for global trade, for the future of North American relations? Well, we've gathered insights from recent news, parliamentary debates, economic analyses, and we're ready to dive deep into these sources to help make sense of it all.
Okay, let's unpack this dramatic development first. The big news today, July 31st. President Trump signs an executive order. Tariffs on Canada jumping from 25% to a pretty striking 35%, and that's effective tomorrow, August 1st. So what's the stated rationale? What's the immediate backdrop here?
Well, the executive order itself, it's quite explicit. It links this tariff hike directly to what the administration is calling Canada's continued inaction and retaliation regarding illicit drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, the claim is that Mexican cartels are increasingly setting up and operating fentanyl and nitazene synthesis labs inside Canada.
Wow, okay. That's a strong claim.
It is. And beyond the drug issue, the president also, he reiterated those longstanding criticisms about Canada's dairy sector defense spending, framing them as, examples of Canada treating the U.S. unfairly. Right, those familiar points.
Exactly. And it's worth noting, this action was taken under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. That's a significant piece of U.S. law. It gives the president really broad powers during national emergencies. So using it signals just how gravely the U.S. administration views this fentanyl public health crisis. They're framing it as an emergency.
That is a strong statement, using IEPA and tying it so directly to fentanyl. But this raises a critical question, doesn't it? Is Canada really the main source of fentanyl the U.S. claims it is? Or is there maybe a different narrative playing out here?
That's a really vital point to dig into. The sources we looked at, they indicate that this U.S. accusation about fentanyl flow from Canada is, well, it seems largely at odds with the actual data available.
Oh.
According to various reports, virtually no fentanyl actually comes from Canada into the U.S. We're talking less than 0.1% of total U.S. seizures.
Less than 0.1%.
Yes, less than 0.1%. It's a striking discrepancy, really. And it kind of highlights how international relations can sometimes, weaponize perceived issues, right? Using a public health crisis as geopolitical leverage, even when the data on the ground tells a dramatically different story.
So where is it coming from then, primarily?
Well, the reports consistently identify Mexican cartels as the critical actors in the vast majority of fentanyl production and smuggling into the U.S.
Okay.
And it's also important, I think, to acknowledge the broader context of the U.S. fentanyl crisis itself. It's complex. While overall overdose deaths have shown a decline since May 2023, about a 12.7% decrease by May 2024.
That sounds like progress.
It is. But unfortunately, that decline is primarily seen among white Americans. Overdose deaths among Black Americans have actually shown an increase during that same period.
Oh, wow. So there are disparities.
Big disparities. It highlights ongoing issues with access to treatment and feeds into this whole complex domestic debate around U.S. drug policies themselves.
That's an astonishing statistic, less than 0.1% from Canada. So if the actual flow is that negligible, what does that tell us about the real motivations behind targeting Canada with these tariffs? It seems disproportionate.
It certainly raises questions about proportionality, yeah.
And how did we even get to this point? This tariff hike, like you said, it's not an isolated event. It feels like the latest shot in something that's been building for months. Can you maybe walk us through the timeline? How did we get to this dramatic escalation today?
Absolutely. Yeah, today's move is definitely the culmination of several strategic steps and, frankly, rising tensions. It really began quite pointedly back in November 2024. That's when then-President-elect Trump first announced his intention to impose a pretty significant 25% tariff on all products from both Mexico and Canada.
On everything, wow.
Yeah. And he explicitly linked that economic threat to combating illegal immigration and, very notably, fentanyl flows.
Yeah.
So right from the start, he was signaling this intent to use trade as leverage for these other issues. Then, just a month later, December 2024, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with Trump, tried to address these concerns directly. Trudeau gave a clear warning, basically saying, look, these tariffs won't just hurt Canadian workers and industries, they're going to raise prices for American consumers, hurt American businesses too.
Makes sense. Interconnected economies.
You'd think so. But despite those diplomatic efforts, Trump publicly kind of dismissed Trudeau's concerns. He even mockingly called him Governor Justin Trudeau of the great state of Canada, which, set a pretty combative tone early on.
Yeah, it's not exactly diplomatic language.
Not really. So fast forward to the new year, February 1st, 2025. Trump officially imposes that 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada imports, and also a 10% tariff on China. But he offered a 1-month reprieve to Mexico and Canada, basically giving them a short window to, quote, curb fentanyl and migrant flows before the tariffs fully kicked in.
A deadline, essentially.
Pretty much. And again, this action was taken under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, i.e. EPA, underscoring the national security framing. Then, just over a week later, Feb 10th, the pressure broadened. Trump expanded the reach of Section 232 tariffs, that's another tool, often controversially used for national security tariffs, on steel and aluminum. He hiked the steel tariff to 25%, and aluminum from 10% up to 25% for imports from all countries, including Canada, of course.
So hitting them again, even beyond the general tariff.
Exactly. Then by March 4th, with the U.S. administration apparently seeing no significant change, Trump fully implemented those 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico imports. The stated reason: their continued failure to arrest traffickers, seize illicit drugs, or coordinate with U.S. law enforcement. And he specifically cited retaliation from Canada as a factor, too.
Retaliation. So Canada had responded by then.
Well, there was a slight complexity first. In early March, the 25% tariffs got temporarily suspended, but only for goods that qualified for duty-free treatment under the USMCA, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA.
Ah, okay. So USMCA goods were spared for a bit.
For a bit, yeah. But non-USMCA goods still face the tariffs. And interestingly, potash tariffs were lowered to 10%. A specific carve-out there. But yes, to your point about retaliation, Canada didn't just stand idly by. On March 13th, in a clear response to those initial U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, Canada hiked its own 25% reciprocal tariffs. And it was on about $30 billion worth of U.S. imports. Things like steel, aluminum, tools, computers, even sports equipment.
So tit for tat.
A clear tit-for-tat escalation. And now, of course, we land here today, July 31st, with the U.S. escalating again, pushing its tariffs on Canada even higher, from 25% up to 35%.
It certainly sounds like Canada's government has been taking pretty significant steps, costly ones too, trying to address these U.S. concerns. Yet the U.S. administration still found them, quote, inadequate. What exactly has Canada done to try and, de-escalate things?
You're right. Canada has rolled out several quite tangible and expensive measures trying to, maybe placate the U.S. or at least show action. First, they announced an additional $910 million. That's specifically for more personnel, new technology, and more canine units right at the U.S.-Canada border. A direct investment in stopping things crossing.
Okay, boots and tech on the ground.
Exactly. Then they created a dedicated fentanyl czar position. They appointed Kevin Brosseau, and he publicly committed to what he himself called the impossible demand of zero fentanyl flows from Canada to the U.S. U.S. So acknowledging the pressure.
Setting a high bar.
An extremely high bar. Also, Ottawa agreed, despite some legal complexities, I understand, to designate Mexican cartels as terrorist groups. That aligns with the U.S. strategic objective.
Right.
And maybe one of the most significant things they proposed was a joint Canada-U.S. strike force. They put up $140 million U.S.
Right.
That's $200 million Canadian, specifically dedicated to combating organized crime and money laundering across the border.
So joint operations, big money, a dedicated czar border security boost.
A whole suite of measures. Yet, despite all these concrete steps, the U.S. still escalated tariffs today. It really suggests either a deep disconnect in expectations or maybe, well, maybe, different strategic objectives are just at play here, beyond the stated reasons.
That's quite a list of initiatives from Canada, yet the pressure just kept mounting.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder about the bigger picture, especially within Canada. While all this is going on internationally, Canada's parliament has been busy. They debated and just passed this major piece of legislation, Bill C-5, the One Canadian Economy Act. Why is this bill suddenly so significant right now?
Yeah.
Especially with all this external pressure.
Yeah, Bill C-5 is definitely a highly significant, really ambitious piece of legislation. And the timing. Probably not a coincidence. It's basically split into two main parts, related but distinct. Part 1 is the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act. And Part 2 is the Building Canada Act.
Okay.
The Liberal government, remember, they came into power after the April 28th election with a new PM and administration. Their stated rationale was a clear mandate to, quote, build one economy domestically.
So an internal focus.
Right, and it's being framed as a direct strategic response to potential U.S. tariffs and these growing trade concerns. The idea is to bolster Canada's internal strength. The overarching goal is pretty multifaceted. Enhance prosperity, improve national security, economic security, national defense, and ultimately Canada's national autonomy in what feels like a pretty volatile global landscape.
So strengthening from within to withstand external shocks, basically.
That seems to be the core idea, trying to control Canada's economic destiny more firmly from inside.
Okay, so let's break down those two parts you mentioned.
Yeah.
Part 1, the free trade and labor mobility bit. What's that actually designed to do inside Canada?
Right. Part 1 aims to tackle something Canada's struggled with for ages, interprovincial trade barriers, and also making it easier for workers to move and work across the country, labor mobility. Essentially, it tries to create a more unified internal market. It does this by recognizing provincially regulated products, services, professional occupations, recognizing them in a federal context.
So like if you're a nurse or an engineer in one province.
Exactly. The idea is that a certified professional, say an engineer or maybe a truck driver qualified in Alberta, should ideally be able to practice or operate their business coast to coast, without facing redundant reaccreditation hurdles or needing multiple, often conflicting permits from different provinces, streamlining that internal bureaucracy.
That sounds like it could unlock a lot of potential.
The projections are certainly optimistic. They talk about generating tremendous amounts of economic flow. There's an estimate of maybe $200 billion in economic benefits just from breaking down these internal barriers, fostering a truly national Canadian market.
But I sense a but.
Well, yeah. Some critics point out that while it's a good step, its scope might only chip away at the problem. Many of the really significant barriers are deeply embedded in provincial regulations, which this federal bill might not fully override. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Okay, fair enough. Now, Part 2, the Building Canada Act. You said this seems to be the more controversial part. What's its core function? Why all the heat?
Right. Part 2 is squarely focused on fast-tracking major projects. Think big infrastructure, resource projects, things deemed to be in the national interest. It sets up an accelerated kind of one-and-done federal approval process. The goal is to replace the existing, often overlapping, sometimes really cumbersome regulatory barriers that can stall these big projects for years.
Trying to provide more certainty for investors.
Exactly. More regulatory certainty attracts significant investment. It also establishes a new federal major projects office to sort of guide these projects through the new system.
And what qualifies as being in the national interest? That sounds potentially broad.
It is potentially broad. There are 5 key criteria listed in the Act. 1, strengthening Canada's autonomy, resilience, or security. 2, providing substantial economic or other tangible benefits. 3, having a high likelihood of successful execution. 4, meaningfully advancing the interests of Indigenous peoples. And 5, contributing positively to clean growth and climate objectives.
Okay, quite a checklist.
It is, but the controversy, as you hinted, largely comes from concerns about federal overreach. Provinces are worried about their jurisdiction. And there are also significant concerns about potentially streamlining environmental reviews and, importantly, indigenous consultation processes too quickly. That's where a lot of the debate happened.
Yeah, I can see how that would spark debate. Given the scope and ambition of this bill, C5, it must have generated a lot of discussion across the political spectrum in Parliament. What were the different takes we heard?
Oh, absolutely. The parliamentary debate was, let's say, vigorous. It really revealed some deeply held differences about Canada's future direction. The Liberals, naturally being the government, they championed the bill, called it urgent, necessary for national economic strength. They argued it would create lots of jobs and, importantly, show Canada's determination to act on its own terms, especially facing this trade war. They kept emphasizing a Team Canada approach, working with premiers.
Okay, the government perspective. What about the opposition, the Conservatives?
The Conservatives, interestingly, acknowledged the bill had flaws, but they largely chose to work on improving it with amendments rather than just opposing it outright. They pushed hard for more accountability, more transparency, things like a public registry for projects, stronger parliamentary oversight. They also wanted amendments to protect provincial jurisdiction and ensure existing laws, like the Indian Act, weren't accidentally sidestepped.
So trying to shape it rather than block it.
Pretty much. Their take was basically that it's a small step in the right direction for getting crucial national projects like pipelines built. However, they didn't miss the chance to criticize the Liberals. They argued the Liberals created the regulatory mess in the first place, pointing to things like Bill C-69, the carbon tax that they believe made this kind of bill necessary.
Okay, a nuanced position there. What about the Bloc Québécois? I imagine they had strong feelings, especially about provincial jurisdiction.
Oh, yes. The Bloc Québécois was vehemently opposed. They pulled no punches, called it a monster of a bill, a parliamentary power grab. They criticized what they saw as an autocratic management style, worrying it would bypass proper debate, skip witness testimony, basically undermining democracy.
Strong words.
Very. Their core argument was that it allowed the federal government to circumvent environmental rules and even suspend existing legislation by order in council. They saw that as a serious infringement on provincial powers, especially Quebec's right to say no to projects within its borders. They also initially flagged that the Canada Labour Code wasn't exempt, though that was later amended.
Okay, a fundamental opposition based on provincial rights and process. And the NDP and Greens, where did they land?
The NDP and the Green Party voiced major concerns too, but primarily focused on different areas. Their big worries were around the potential violation of Indigenous rights. They felt there wasn't enough guarantee of free, prior, and informed consent. Some even drew parallels to the Idle No More 2.0 movement, which was a huge Indigenous rights movement. They also shared grave concerns about overriding environmental standards. Groups like the Canadian Cancer Society actually raised flags about potentially weaker standards. And they brought up the risk of public health crises, citing historical tragedies like the Walkerton water contamination event in Ontario as a cautionary tale.
So environmental and Indigenous rights were their main focus.
Primarily. Both parties also criticized the whole process as being rushed, calling it leaping before looking. But despite all these diverse and often very strong objections from different corners, Bill C-5 did ultimately pass, albeit with some amendments worked in during the legislative process reflecting those political compromises needed to get such major legislation across the line.
That's a really complex picture, isn't it? All this internal political maneuvering happening right alongside intense external pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So beyond the political debates and the legislative battles over C5, what are the tangible economic consequences Canada is already facing from these escalating trade tensions? And what might the future hold for these really critical North American relationships?
Well, the immediate economic impacts are quite visible and, yeah, concerning for Canada. The Canadian dollar, the loonie, it's already depreciated noticeably against the U.S. dollar. That's being directly linked to what analysts call economic uncertainty and investor confidence taking a hit. And, of course, a potential decline in demand for Canadian exports because of the tariffs.
So investors getting nervous.
Exactly. And in times of global tension like this, the U.S. dollar often acts as a kind of safe haven asset. Money flows towards it, away from currencies seen as maybe more volatile, like the Canadian dollar right now.
Right.
This situation also creates strong potential, maybe even pressure, for the Bank of Canada to cut interest rates. They might do that to try and stimulate the Canadian economy, counteract any slowdown. But ironically, cutting rates could further depreciate the Canadian dollar against the U.S. dollar. It's a tricky balancing act.
Definitely sounds like it. So what's the advice for Canadians?
The advice floating around is pretty standard for this kind of uncertainty. Think about diversifying investments, maybe include some U.S. stocks or international ETFs. And there's also a strong emphasis on supporting domestic industries, by Canadian to try and strengthen the local economy against these external shocks.
Makes sense. And looking south at the broader U.S. foreign policy approach, we mentioned the tariffs, the IEPA. What else is part of this picture?
Well, we also see the Trump administration's ongoing rhetoric and, frankly, threats beyond Canada, like potentially designating Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, and even hints about possible U.S. military action in Mexico.
Wow, that's huge.
Incredibly complex moves. And while they're aimed at perceived threats, many analysts worry they could be counterproductive. They could actually undermine the existing U.S.-Mexico cooperation on fighting crime and have severe impacts on things like remittances, the money sent home by workers, which is vital for Mexico's economy.
So unintended consequences are a big risk.
A huge risk. Even cooperation with China on fentanyl precursors, the chemicals used to make it, has seen pretty mixed results. Some reports suggest supply from China might be down a bit, but illicit networks are really adaptable. They find ways to evade controls. It's an ongoing challenge.
This whole dynamic, it's clearly about so much more than just tariffs, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's this deep interplay of national sovereignty, economic resilience, domestic politics, and just the intricate, often really volatile dance of navigating a rapidly shifting global landscape. It feels like this is impacting both nations profoundly.
It really speaks to a new era, maybe, where economic policy, national security, domestic concerns, they're all tangled together.
I think that's right. This deep dive really reveals that this escalating trade war between the U.S. and Canada, which is so heavily intertwined with the complexities of the U.S. fentanyl crisis, it isn't just some political spat or a simple economic dispute. It feels more like a powerful catalyst. It's forcing Canada, in particular, to fundamentally reevaluate its internal economic structures, its whole place on the global stage, really. And it vividly highlights how quickly external pressures can demand these profound internal transformations, and how varied, often conflicting political visions within a country have to grapple with that huge challenge.
Indeed. So as these new higher tariffs come into effect tomorrow, and Canada pushes forward with this really ambitious One Canadian Economy project, it leaves us with maybe this provocative thought for you, our listeners, to consider. In a world where economic threats and security threats seem to be merging, becoming almost indistinguishable sometimes, can nations truly achieve self-sufficiency, real strength, by primarily looking inward, by fortifying their domestic structures? Or will they always ultimately be compelled to adapt, sometimes painfully, to the relentless and shifting tides of global power dynamics? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of these critical developments shaping our North American landscape.